We've been told to push fiber and that it's good for bacterial diversity, but diversity doesn't equal health. What equals health is what bacteria are in the gut. We like to think the microbiome is the gut. It's not, it's everything. Getting a lot of sun on your skin will shift the microbiome more than diet will. That really does mean not wearing a ton of clothes so that you get as much sun exposure as possible. And on the flip side of that, not using the sunscreens and the hats and the sunglasses. So there's this bacteria called Akkermansia that increases GLP-1. Most people are tuned in enough to know that all the Hollywood stars are using Ozempic. Well, what that does is what Akkermansia does. It increases GLP-1. So rather than going to a physician and getting a prescription and injecting yourself, you can simply seed Akkermansia into your body and start losing weight right away, as it does the same thing, but the way nature intended. And anytime someone is struggling with their weight, it's an indication that something is not right in the body. Something is creating inflammation. A healthy person with a healthy microbiome does not ever struggle with weight. It doesn't matter if they eat a lot. The microbiome handles that just fine, and their weight stays the same all the time.
Mary, what would you say are some of the most problematic foods we're consuming over here in the West, thinking they're healthy, but are actually having a detriment to our health?
I would definitely say potatoes should be on that list because the plant toxins are so difficult to process out. And I don't see any companies that are doing that for us. So that would be a really big one, along with things like raw spinach. So high oxalate foods eaten as a health food, as opposed to seasonally and appropriately. And then right now, after what the world has been through over the last few years, I would include things like white rice, which I normally wouldn't discuss in that way. White rice is a traditional food. It doesn't cause too many problems. It doesn't have a lot of plant toxins, but because it has the unique nature to bind to thiamine or B1 and deplete that, when we're dealing with cytokine-based illnesses, it can be a huge issue. So if not eaten in the context of a traditional diet with pork or fish in a great degree. So I would say those are probably the top.
Any other foods in that same category as rice that are having that binding effect?
Yes, there are. Like cassava does as well, but it's not eaten as much as a white rice. There are several foods actually that can do the binding, but white rice is by far the worst as far as that goes.
And when you mentioned spinach, you mentioned oxalates. Are they something you personally totally avoid? It sounded like there was some seasonality to how you responded to that.
Yes.
For yourself and then for the population as a whole, how do you look at oxalates and avoiding them or consuming them periodically?
You know, I'm not a rigid person. So unless I have a set health goal for myself, I don't fully avoid things, with the exception of things that aren't appealing to me or I know too much about, like potatoes. But the high oxalate foods traditionally were not much of a problem unless you were in Greece or one of the regions that had a long growing season for these foods. And also you would have to couple that with not eating dairy, right? Because dairy binds to the oxalate and helps to protect you. So traditionally, spinach would have been had 3 weeks of the year. It would have been sautéed with cream and usually garlic. The cream would bind to the oxalates in the spinach and the person wouldn't have a problem. The way I see it consumed today, when I go to a retreat, when I go to a conference, I see it sold as a health food. Isn't it good that we're having these green smoothies and these juices and salads? And so I think it's actually kind of sad because the people that are trying the hardest are causing some of the worst health issues for themselves in the future with some of these items. But traditionally, oxalates were not as much of a problem because of the traditional context and seasonality. So as far as what I do, I definitely consume them in a seasonal manner and according to the traditional diet. And I don't fully exclude. I eat some nuts and I definitely eat chocolate. So
you mentioned the dairy factor, consuming them together to help. Well, I'll have you talk more about the mechanism there with blocking some of the absorption. Any other hacks for somebody that is going to consume oxalates to help dampen that absorption and impact on the body?
Yes. One big one, this would be through supplements. It would be to have the citrate form of either magnesium or calcium. So calcium if you're prone to diarrhea, magnesium if you have normal stools or you're prone to constipation, simply because of how they move prokinetically on the bowel. But otherwise through food, it's really dairy. is the one thing that combines. The form of calcium that is in dairy is not the same form that's found in vegetables and other foods. And it has a unique ability to bind to the oxalate crystals and remove them from the body.
And when it comes to calcium supplementation, there's a lot of controversy there over causing health complications through a supplement form. Is there a certain form we need to be mindful and take?
Yes.
Is that a total myth when it comes to the problems with supplementing with it? How do you feel about that?
That's a great thing that you brought up. It's been overly supplemented, right? It was believed that if we took a lot of calcium, our bones would be stronger, not realizing that there's this dance that goes on with the minerals of the body. And so if all 72 aren't in perfect alignment, you actually get bones that look very strong in a scan, but fracture at a much higher rate. It's very similar to if you look at fabrics under a microscope. If I look at wool or silk under a microscope, there's all these little threads and it looks kind of weak. But if I pull it, it stretches, it doesn't break. Whereas if I look at polyester or rayon under a microscope, it looks like a steel bar. It looks so strong. If I pull it, it snaps. It's very similar to what has happened with bones with the calcium supplementation. Now, if someone has enough boron in their diet, which if you live in desert areas, you tend to have, it's not guaranteed, folks. Look it up. And it depends where you're getting your water, if you're importing it or not, and also where your food is being grown. But if you have sufficient amounts of boron in the body, that acts as the conductor and it regulates the minerals. So it will uptake things that you need and push out things that you don't. And so in that situation, you're pretty good. But otherwise, you do end up with that problem. So what do we do? The form of calcium that is so good for oxalates is the citrates. And it doesn't have to be calcium. It can be magnesium. It can be any of the other things. So that's a really easy way to go around it, is to simply use magnesium or potassium if that's good for you. But the other form of calcium that I'll use sometimes is glucarate, simply for estrogen-based issues. It's very good for binding. Those don't seem to have the problems. But again, I would never do those long-term, like they were suggesting for the bone health.
The other area of controversy beyond the bone quality piece is clogging up of vessels in the body. Calcium depositing when it's in supplement form. Have you seen anything in the research showing any validity to that?
Well, the calcium deposits are calcium oxalate crystals. So it has to do with the consumption of oxalates, actually. Mm-hmm.
So basically, calcium is getting a bad rap because of the oxalates.
Yes.
Is it that they're in conjunction and then building up in the vessels?
That's right. It's like a marriage in the body. And it's the form of calcium that comes in vegetables. So a really easy way, whenever I see calcium deposits in someone, I immediately get them on dairy if we can tolerate it. And if they don't, then we'll do like a magnesium citrate to bind to it instead. And we start reducing the oxalates very gently. If you suddenly go from eating a ton of oxalates, so having spinach salads and walnuts and all the things, and then you cut them out in certain individuals, and there's more than I'd like to think, you can radically change the pH of the blood rather quickly, and it can be a bit dangerous. So you want to go down slowly, just by like 50 milligrams of oxalate a week. So you calculate your general intake. Most people are going to be around 300 a day that I see coming off the streets. And so each week we would take them down. The first week we would go to 250, then 200 and such until you get to about 50. And then you can maintain that. You don't have to go to zero for most folks.
Let's expand out and talk about dairy in a general sense, because there's different forms of dairy. There's the A1, A2. There's pasteurized versus unpasteurized, grass-fed animals versus, grain-fed. Different animals that are producing milk, and you can get milk in, different forms like sheep milk and goat and cow. So let's open that up and have you talk about dairy as a whole.
Great.
As a health food.
Yeah.
And the continuum, if there's, I'm assuming there must be good and bad, and I'll have you talk about all that.
There is, and it really is a health food. So I realize people really struggle to eat dairy right now, but that has more to do with what kind of dairy you're having and also the state of your body and what you've been eating over your lifetime. It's no one's fault, right? We're fed food. So, so please don't take offense. But the best kind of dairy would be A2. So that would either be from very specific breeds of cows, like the Jersey, or from other animals. So every other animal produces A2. That's A2 beta casein. That's the kind of protein and actually the kind of lectin it has. So lectins can be toxic or non-toxic. There's not a word that discerns them. But the A1 dairy that most of us have been raised on with the black and white cows, right, the Holsteins, and also in Northern Europe and Ireland, kind of the Nordic countries along with Germany, all of these breeds these regions tend to use the A1 breeds. And there's a reason for that. They produce about 3 times as much milk. So it's as from a business standpoint, that is very good. However, from a health standpoint, it's not, because humans cannot break down the A1 beta casein. It's a sticky protein, just like we see in the zucchini and in certain foods that you have to process out. It doesn't mean you can't eat those foods. It needs to be processed out. But in dairy, we don't have a very good way to do that. So when someone has been consuming a lot of A1 beta casein throughout their life, it can really impair the immune system and damage the nervous system as well, leading to a whole host of other issues. So the A2 is pretty important, at least for the way that I do it. And I don't mean to say that that's the right way for everyone, but the way that I do it is that I eat A2 at home. And then when I'm at a restaurant or a friend's house, I don't care. So it's very good socially. It's easy to get around. Now, granted, with the places I travel, that's pretty easy. Most places are already A2. So like if you're in Greece or you're in Spain, one of the places that uses a lot of sheep dairy, that's a slam dunk. That's already A2. Same with camel, same with buffalo. Really, all the other animals are A2. So I would say A2 is probably the most important, followed then by unpasteurized, so that you have the proper enzymes, the proper probiotics, and all those things. You know, one thing we really, really lack is broad introduction of small amounts of several different kinds of ferments and probiotics. And when I think the world catches on to how imperative these little bugs are and how different each one is, even within each family, right? Like if you look at the family of Planetarum, each substrain within that does completely different things in the body. And so you start to realize like, well, yeah, I have yogurt, or when I eat Korean, I have kimchi, but when else are you getting these probiotics and the wonderful vitamins from dairy as well, the ADK? So I really find real dairy to be a superfood, and definitely worth hunting out.
And always full fat.
Yes. Yeah. Always. Yeah. There, as many forms of dairy naturally are lean. So if eating high fat is problematic for you, just do like a yogurt, not a Greek yogurt, and you're good to go, right? Or a kefir. So there's forms that are more lean than, say, a sour cream if you need to do that, but I wouldn't get artificially lean.
If you're enjoying this episode, take a second and let me know by clicking like and subscribe below. Thank you so much, and now back to the show. All right, we're going to come back to the microbiome piece. I want to get deep into that with you again. But you mentioned lectins there, and the good and the bad. And you touched on this last time we chatted, but I want to get deeper into understanding that. When it comes to dairy, the A1, A2, are those specifically lectins?
Yes.
Okay. Expand out from there and talk more about, we know A2 is better.
Yeah.
But take this conversation into a broader sense in the realm of lectins and how you look at good versus bad in different foods.
So yeah, that's a really hard thing to convey, because it's actually just black and white. It's either classified as a toxin for all mammals or not. So some of the lectins are and some are not. Like the lectin in avocados doesn't cause the issues to us. The lectin in A2 milk doesn't do it, but the A1 lectin does. The lectin in beans does. And lectins on their own, especially in the plant world, are very often not difficult to process out. So that's not a hard thing to bring into your daily life or to buy products that are already that way. But dairy would be the exception.
Okay, so in a practical sense, is it just knowing, is there like a list we can go to foods that are bad lectins versus good? It sounds like with the black and white nature, it's just a learning thing.
It's a learning thing. Yeah, that's really it. And it's something that in traditional societies, they already implemented, so they didn't need a list for, but we really do because we've honestly been taught that the worst foods for us are the healthiest. And so it gets very confusing, for us in particular. You know, we've gone really raw and kind of towards salads and all these kinds of things where the toxins are not processed out in any way through cooking, fermentation, and soaking in the traditional methods. And so we do have to be a bit more intentional.
So what are the biggest ones to be on the lookout for? It sounds like A1 dairy is one. You mentioned avocados, they're fine.
Yeah,
Talk
they're
about
fine.
some of the top most harmful ones that we want to be aware of.
Well, I think the most insidious ones are the ones in the foods that we consider health foods. So the ones that we're really piling on. So if you're someone who eats raw nuts, that's problematic. Nuts have to be soaked and sprouted. If you're someone who eats a lot of the nightshades are problematic, honestly, not so much for the lectins, for the other problems in there. But the lectin plus the solanines, it stays in the body for so long. So that causes quite a bit of problem. Whereas if you're having lectins from, say, pumpkin, that's not going to stay in the body for more than a day or so. So it's not as problematic, right? The squash family, the pulse family, these all need to be fermented or cooked out. Parts of it are more problematic than others. So if you're looking at the squash family, it's the skin and the seeds that are the most problematic, right? So when you have something small like a zucchini and you make that into noodles, you're going to get a lot more of the toxic lectin from that than you would from a pumpkin or a butternut squash where you don't eat the skin and the seeds are optional if you eat them.
I wanted to come back to the potato. You mentioned nightshades. I believe potato is under that category. Am I right?
It is. That's correct.
Okay, so talk more
Yeah.
about that potato specifically, if there's anything there, and then the bigger category of nightshades. And do we want to totally avoid those? How do you look at that category?
It's a really good idea to avoid those, especially if you're trying to come back from a health issue and not just for arthritis, not just for pain conditions. It is, the nightshade family has an enormous amount of plant toxins and they're fat soluble. So they're a bit insidious. You often don't feel it and it can take 60 to 90 days of a full elimination before you would see any benefit at all. But it's very cumulative. And what it really affects is the fat tissue in the body. So that's your cell membrane, that's your nervous system, right? And because it's fat soluble, it does also bind to the water soluble toxins, which would usually come out of the body quite quickly. And it keeps them in there where they can cause damage for 60, 90 days. So it's hugely problematic. Now, that's not to say that these didn't have a historical context in some regions, but the amount of effort that has to go in to process the toxins out of these plants is so gargantuan. And I just got back to America and no one has time here for anything. So let alone, if someone makes their own beer, it's like an adorable hobby, but unless you have a full homestead and you've really studied Peruvian potato processing, like Dr. Bill Schindler, like if you go to his restaurant, eat his potatoes, he does them correctly. But outside of that, I wouldn't be, increasing your toxic load, because one of the things we're really dealing with today is an almost insurmountable amount of toxins in the body that no matter how much effort you put into clean, you're still breathing so much in. You can't keep yourself in a total bubble and it wouldn't be healthy to, right? So we want to lessen where we can so that we're the most resilient. At least that's how I like to think. It doesn't mean you guys have to think that way, but I like to be resilient and robust, and nightshades do the opposite.
All right, so we have nightshades. We've talked about lectins, certain lectins. In the food realm, and then I want to expand out to lifestyle as well, what other big toxins are impacting our health in a negative way?
Well, in the food realm,
We've talked about
yeah,
oxalates.
I would really
There's
say those
phytates
are,
are often
yeah,
talked about, and
phytates, but I wouldn't put them as a major, honestly. I would have back in the 80s, but I wouldn't say now it's one of the major ones. The ones I see the worst really are the nightshades and the oxalates, and then the lectins. Those really are the worst ones that I see. Not to say that there's not a lot of other plant toxins, there are, and the thiamine binding, and there's cyanide, of course, and these kind of things. But with many of the other plants, there's so much benefit to them that then it's a cost benefit analysis. It's not a slam dunk, just negative. Whereas with those, it's really there. And then I think the most insidious are outside of the food world from there. But before we move on, I would say the rancid oils should be included in that, into the toxic sludge of food, right? So the rancid seed oils, the omega-6s, those are hugely problematic.
and that ties back to what you mentioned before, the cell membranes.
That's right.
And they build up in the
Exactly.
cell membrane. So talk
Yeah.
more about those. What exactly are we talking about there? Seed oils, vegetable oils,
hmm Yeah. So
and
all of those.
how cautious do we need to be avoiding those?
Well, I think if someone was a biochemist and they cared about their health, it would be 100% exclusion. However, I study health as a whole. Looking in, I work in the microbiome, and with the microbiome, you have to look at everything because it's affected by who you spend time with, how much daylight you get, where you are, what your posture is, all sorts of things. And so I tend to look more broad and take an eagle eye view. And I find socials, not just me, research as well, socials are so incredibly important. And although there are certainly times where we do need to be perfect in order to get into remission, like I was one of those cases, right? In general, you don't want to live that way once you get to a state of health, because then it's very isolating. And isolation for humans, we're social creatures, as much as many people don't want to be, that is what we are. We get very sick in isolation. We get ill. So I do think it's more important to be social while also controlling what you can at home. That way, your habits, which really build up the most of you, right? What you do day in and day out, those are really strong and healthy. And then if you're at a loved one's house or you're out to eat with friends, you can just get like a grilled steak and not ask what it was marinated in, because it's not very often. Now, I wouldn't say that's scientifically perfect, because really we shouldn't be having any of those, and they do last for 2 years. So there's genuine reasons why many people will be rigid on that topic. I try to be rigid. I am just not a rigid person. So, so personally for me, I will still eat at the restaurants, maybe not deep fried, but otherwise.
You made a really good point there I want to highlight, where it depends on your health status coming into this, how tight you need to be with what we're talking about here and beyond. And if somebody is suffering, like we got into your health story last time, you need to likely be more tight with all this to heal.
Yes.
Than somebody who's gotten to, stable ground where you're at with your health now, and you can go out to a restaurant and not worry about it as much. So everybody's going to have their own unique health journey and point in time, and they need to make that decision for themselves.
Completely. And I do think that there's a wonderful way to have social graces, regardless of how strict you have to be. So even if you have to be on the most strict diets, like I did, no one has to know when you go to a restaurant. You can just eat before. There are ways around it, so that it's not awkward, so it doesn't all become about your health and things that honestly, usually people who are sick don't want to talk about. Anyway, they want to break from it too. So there's easy ways to avoid it socially and still have the socials while having to be really perfect, because there is a time for that and a place for sure.
And when it comes to all these different plant toxins, you mentioned the fact that the seed oils can stay in the body up to a couple of years. And with the potatoes, I believe it was the solanines, fat-soluble toxin can bind to water-soluble, and those can stay in the body for a long period of time as well. When you're working with somebody and they've been eating a lot of these foods, is it just about elimination and letting their body take care of removal? Or is there a way to help the body in that process?
There are ways, actually. In general, historically, it has been about removing the items and allowing the body to regrow and to do what it does best, right? It is always smarter than we are. We are always catching up and getting humbled. But there are also things that you can use. And that's why I briefly mentioned earlier, I think there's a cost benefit analysis that can be done with certain plants. So, for instance, there are foods that I would classify as glyconutrients or long chain sugars that are not sweet. These are found in things like shrimp shells and bone marrow and onions and garlic and carrots, artichokes. And at high amounts, they bind to fat soluble toxins. So they can be very helpful at pulling hormones out of the body or man-made chemicals out of the body. Those can really be used. Broccoli, cauliflower, they're all in that family too. Inulin, like if you ever go to New Orleans, they have chicory in the coffee. That's another one. So those can really be used if it's appropriate in an individual case.
And how do you feel about grains?
Oh,
And this ties into our lectin part of the conversation with gluten being a common thing people are avoiding. So how do you feel about gluten specifically and then grains in general?
so gluten is one of those lectins. It's a natural toxin for all humans, and some people notice it a lot more than others. But one of the problems I see, and one of the reasons why I don't teach gluten-free diets, I mean, I do, but we just don't even do any of that stuff, right? It's so far beyond that. But is because when you eliminate gluten, you often go to potato and all these other foods that are actually far more problematic. and so I'm not a big fan of gluten-free. Now, what I am a big fan of, especially if you're healthy enough to have starch, is to have properly fermented. So, when I was in France, I think last time when we were talking, I was absolutely eating the baguette, which is a 72-hour ferment. So it takes the gluten particle from 72,000 down to 12. That's no big deal. That's how humans are supposed to eat gluten. So if something is properly fermented like that, or again, like Dr. Schindler does at his restaurant, great. That's really good. The way that most people are eating gluten today is highly problematic, and it certainly doesn't help that then again, they are often eating it with nightshades, right? So you've got pasta with tomato sauce. Two things that should never go together because that lectin has not been fermented from the pasta. And now you're having it with the tomato, which is going to hold it in the body for 60 to 90 days. So the combinations and the way that we're eating now is hugely problematic with gluten. But in general, I feel almost flat about gluten. I don't feel like it's one of the biggest problems. It's more of a symptom of the overall way that we're eating and living.
All right, before we move away from things in plants that could be harming us, any other big ones in that category we've missed?
No, I would say those are the big ones, really. There's certainly others, like we mentioned phytates and things like that, but phytates were more of a problem in the 90s diets. And not to say that they've disappeared, but in the 90s, we were very high grain. And then in the late 90s, there was kind of this trend for moms to come home and have a small handful of nuts when they got home, right? And all of this was raw. The nuts were raw and the grains were not fermented. And then soy became a really big thing, right? So all these really high phytate foods were pretty through the roof then. And now that's kind of tapered down as people are going and eating in a different direction. So phytates are unquestionably an issue, but I think they're much less of an issue than traditionally speaking.
You mentioned soaking before. I'm not sure if that was in relation to nuts.
Mm-hmm.
But let's talk about nuts specifically, soaking, roasting, different categories of treatment if somebody's going to consume those, and how do we make them into a health food?
Yes. So nuts really are traditional. So as long as we're eating actual nuts and not beans, which are the peanuts and the cashews, then all we have to do is soak it, sprout it, and you can leave it like that, or you can roast it. What you don't want to do is take it either raw or have it so cooked that it's rancid, right? But a nice roasting is very good for us. So you can go about it either way. I always like to soak and sprout mine, and then I leave them in big jars. And if I decide to roast them later, I might do that, especially with seasonings, things like that for the holidays. But the main thing is to kind of back away from this bullet point method that we tend to have of like, this is good. You should have a quarter cup of it every single day. No humans ever ate that way, and there's a reason for it. We need to not have nuts every day of the year or spinach or these other things. And so one of the reasons why nuts can become a problem is when people start eating, handfuls of them, or thinking because they're healthy, that they're not going to cause weight gain, which nuts are a recipe for weight gain. FYI, it's literally how I put weight on when people are emaciated is with nuts and honey and fruit. The combination of carbs plus that kind of fat, it's just amazing. Actually, it's really helpful when you need to gain weight. So if anyone out there needs to gain weight, now you know what to do. But yeah, so nuts are really good, but not in massive quantities, not like 2 cups a day. You don't want to have tons of baked goods. I see that problem with the GAPS diet often. People will start eating just enormous amounts of baked goods with almond flour and other nut flours. So just remember, not year round, occasional treats.
And talk about the continuum. What nuts do you look at as being the healthiest and then going down from there?
That's a great question. I think the 2 highest fat nuts are the healthiest. That's your macadamia and your pecan. I think pecan is 88% fat and macadamia is usually around 90% fat. And what that means is that you're not going to have as many of the plant toxins. So very often my oxalate folks, as long as it's not a really severe case, can still do some macadamia or pecan, especially if you add some butter in the middle and make a little sandwich. They're very good. So those are my 2 favorites. Once you get past that, then you've got things like the walnut, which a lot of people won't tolerate because of the histamines. Then you've got the almonds, which are delicious. Pistachio are very good too. They're the highest carbs. So if you do well with carbs, that's a good one. Yeah, that's kind of how I would order them. I would put cashews as something that we should not be eating in general.
You quickly touched on beans, and it sounded like they were a no-go.
Well,
Can they be part of a healthy diet with certain ways of preparing them?
Yes. Yeah, they actually can. Most people today, their microbiome is a bit too compromised, but traditionally beans were never a problem. People always cooked them appropriately. They do need to be soaked for a long amount of time and then processed, but they also have that soluble fiber that can bind to the fat soluble toxins. So there's people like Karen Hurd who teach whole protocols around this. Very interesting, a very different way to get at SIBO and other things. So they can be. I don't use them with folks that I work with, but they can have them once they go into remission. There's not a problem with that. And there's certainly, on the GAPS diet, you can do lentils if you're full GAPS. But most people I know who go through it, they do more of intro through the whole thing and then go to full once they're in remission. So it can, as a short answer, yes. Historically, not a problem. But if you have a health issue, I don't know if I'd use it.
Up until this point, we've been heavily focused on toxins, bad things in plants that are going to damage our health. Flipping that around and looking at that from a superfood perspective, if that even exists, you're a good person to ask as somebody who's traveled around the world where a lot of these exotic superfoods originated. Any of them of any value?
Yes, but only in small amounts and infrequently. So where plants really shine, especially as like a medicine, is appropriate use at the right time. It's not in the daily use. I keep catching people on turmeric all the time. And turmeric is a lectin. It actually causes health issues when you take it every day. It can be used for short periods of time. And that's typically how medicine works, right? It works for a short period of time. So even something like I love ginger. I could eat ginger all the time. But if I were to include it into my daily diet, thinking that I was getting a lot of health benefits from that, well, there's also a cost to each of these things. And so the continual daily use is typically problematic. I can't think of any plant foods that are truly just good. And I really wouldn't consider anything outside of the animal world a true superfood. But I would say that each of them has a bit of a benefit. And so it depends on what's going on at the time. The plants with the most benefit would be the glyconutrient foods. So that would be things like the Asian mushrooms and like the onions, the garlic, these types of things. But again, those have sulfur. And so there's a cost as well.
And in a general sense, does a lot of the benefit with these healthy plants come from a hermetic effect?
Definitely the antioxidants have that. So antioxidants, people think are really healthy because we've been told that. But the science isn't there, actually. For all the products that have been sold, the science is not there. So when you consume a high antioxidant food, right? Let's say a concentrate, and it goes into the body. It's inflammatory. It's not anti-inflammatory. It's inflammatory. And so it calls the attention of the immune system. And it is the immune system that then in reaction creates the anti-inflammatory state. Well, if you are doing that all the time, it's too much of a stress on the body. It doesn't do that. And with those two, even though that's a hermetic effect, there's a negative as well, especially when you get into the realm of cancer, because cancer will take those antioxidants, surround itself with it, and the immune system won't even see the cancer. They'll just see the antioxidants. So there's always a bit of a good and bad, I would say, and it's really wisdom that needs to come in. So that you know when to use what and for how much, or so that it's honestly more intuitive. In traditional societies, they're never thinking about these kinds of things because it's built into the habit of the seasons in the year. And that is really the way to live. It's not natural to be thinking about what we're eating all the time. Do we have to now? Yes, very often, especially to get better. But it's not very natural. It can be a bit stressful. So the more that can kind of be incorporated, the better. Like you may associate ginger with fall, right? And so you have ginger in the fall. And then if you get sick, you use it too, that kind of thing. And so having things very set to times of years will prevent you over consuming these foods.
Given what we've said about plants being this double-edged sword and having to be careful we don't overdo it, how do you look at spices medicinally as flavoring your food? How do we use those in a healthful way?
It's such a good question. Okay. I grew up wild harvesting. I loved nature. My mom didn't know what to do with me. She was a Southern belle. So she got me into this wonderful program that all summer would take me out into the woods and teach me how to wild harvest and then use these as medicine. And it was so fun. So from a very young age, I was involved with that. And as I became older, I really became the baker and the chef of the family, really baking though. And I worked at some farms and things like that, making the pies. And so I got quite into spices. And with my travels, it's been one of my favorite things to do, to go to places like Zanzibar and other places where they have these wonderful historical spice trades. But I would say by and large, the more that I've learned and the healthier that I've become and the longer I've been in practice, the less I use. Actually, definitely the less I use. I do it more for pleasure now than any kind of medicine. I find far better medicines than the spices because the spices do have a cost to them as well. So there's some exceptions there, like clove, phenomenal against parasites. There's a reason why people suck on it like a mint when you're in certain regions. Like it is very good. Cinnamon can be very beneficial, the real cinnamon. If anyone ever cannot, their period is very delayed. If you drink very strong cinnamon tea, it brings it on. So those things are very good. But in general, spices I have not seen much of in the traditional indigenous lands where I go. It's minimal use. And so I think my palate has honestly changed. I've become very happy with very well cooked food. So it like melts in your mouth, but not needing a lot of seasoning and spice. So I've kind of gone less in that direction, I would say. It's made it a lot easier for traveling because if I have a pot and some good salt, I'm kind of good to go, maybe some fresh herbs. But I think the health trend of like the 90s, which I realize is so far back for many of you listeners, I'm dating myself, but the 90s were really heavy with that. They were like, add a teaspoon of this and a teaspoon of that and put this on this and add this to your oatmeal and all of that. And actually, I think it is much more in what you were saying a bit earlier, what you take out than what you put in. That really leads to true health.
Come back to salt. That's one of those controversial things. And it sounds like you're a fan.
Mm-hmm.
You have both camps, people that are totally avoiding it for blood pressure reasons, people in the health world often using Himalayan salt and different sea salt as a health promoting food type item. How do you feel about that and how do you incorporate it?
I have an unhealthy love affair with salt. So I should just, I feel like I need to put that on the table first. I deeply, deeply love salt, and I could write poetry to the different kinds of salt. I collect it. I love it. I give it as gifts. I take it as trading items to bring to the tribal lands. So no, I love salt. Salt is really good for us. The salt that causes health issues is the refined salt that has the other minerals stripped away. And so when we strip away the other minerals and we give just pure sodium, then we can get into trouble with things like high blood pressure. But to be honest, high blood pressure has far more to do with a lack of potassium or overall inflammation or weight. So, kind of pinning it on salt is kind of silly. Sea salt is an incredible health food. And in fact, there's a number of conditions you can trick the brain into reversing simply by using salt at certain times, like under the tongue before you go to sleep, can trigger the body to think that it's well hydrated when it's extremely dehydrated, and other things. So, a lot of our health issues today are quite new. We have a lot of overhydration, yet under. So we have too much water, but underhydration in the cellular level, meaning we're not uptaking the minerals into the cell correctly. And so we get this condition called waterlogged. It's the slang term for it. But the more minerals that we have and the more real salt, the traditional salt that we have, the better hydrated we are, the less water we need, and the better our body can conduct electricity, right? Because we very much are electrical beings. And oh my goodness, with the research coming out with light and energy and how the bacteria use that, it will put to rest whether or not salt is bad for us. No, I think it's very good. Mm-hmm.
You tied the salt into hydration. Let's go deeper into hydration in a general sense. Do you look at thirst as the mechanism to determine how much to drink in a day? What kind of water do you drink? And then what other beverages do you include in your routine?
Oh, great. That's a really good question. I had to really train myself to drink less because the condition I had when I was sick would cause incredible dehydration. So usually you're on IVs all the time. And they tell you to drink a lot of water as well. And as you drink more water, it's like eating more carbs. What happens when we eat more carbs than a human is meant for? We get into insulin resilience, right? Same thing with hydration. We get vasopressin resilience. So we start to get issues with getting the uptake into the cell of hydration. So we'll get too much in the serum, too much in the body, too little in the cell. What I did, especially after studying some of the Russian dry fasting, which I found so fascinating, was that I just stopped drinking as much. I went to sipping when I was thirsty because in general, we should be using our thirst mechanisms. And that is certainly, like, if you were in my office, that's what I would be telling you. Sip, but use your thirst mechanisms. Don't drink because you're supposed to. And those can get pretty deregulated. But if you start drinking less, then it will start to regulate. And what you'll find is that you'll just kind of forget. You won't bring water with you when you get into the car or when you go on a trip or get on a flight. You won't even think of it because you're not actually thirsty. And so you can start drinking a lot less and your body will regulate your hydration better. So you're less dehydrated, actually drinking less. And it starts to regulate from there. But I will say, the indigenous groups that I go and visit, they barely drink and they can go all day without anything. They're not thirsty and they're perfectly hydrated. They're regulating their vasopressin, their electrolytes ideally. Whereas we are doing the opposite. It's always a shock whenever I come home to America, but I was in the store yesterday getting some things and there were these water bottles that were like the size of half my body. And they had glitter on them. They were beautiful. I mean, I'm sure people like to carry them, but they are massive. No one needs any kind of drink, whether it's alcohol or coffee or water or anything in that amount. So we have it very skewed, I would say.
And when it comes to type of water, what do you look for? Spring water, reverse osmosis?
In general, really the best that is just easy and safe is going to be a natural spring water. So something like I think it's Mountain Valley. Is that what it is? Yeah, Mountain Valley is quite good. There's another one. Sorry, I've been out of the country for too long. I don't remember the name. Icelandic. That one is very good, but that one comes in typically in plastic. You can get it in glass, but usually that. Ideally, though, you do want it from a natural source because then it's going to have the right mineral balance. Anything else is going to be a sacrifice. And we haven't found a perfect way to get a very nicely hydrated water. Now, one thing that can be done is if you have a source of water that doesn't have fluoride and things like that in it, then you can make broth, right? Or teas. And that would be the more traditional way to consume fluids would be a ferment like a beet kvass or a tea, an herbal tea, right? Or a broth, which is probably the most common. That is definitely what I see the most.
How do you feel about carbonated water, coffee?
Oh, well, I love my coffee. I have coffee every morning. So I would be a hypocrite if I said don't. And it is a traditional food. I was speaking at a conference earlier this year, and the topic of the conference was on detox. And I made a little joke about how whenever you go on a detox, the first things they always pull out are the traditional foods. Coffee is a traditional food. It's a traditional drink. And although perhaps it's not traditional in the way we're having it now in our giant 32-ounce gulp glasses, it is very traditional. So no, I love coffee and I'm fine with people having it as long as they tolerate it well. You usually know. There were many years I couldn't have it. You usually know if you feel worse when you have it, you shouldn't do it. And there are some negatives, right? It has some histamines. It can deplete thiamine. So there's some things that people would have issue with, but 1 to 2 cups a day does not cause problems and it doesn't imbalance the microbiome. So it is one of the few vices you can do when on a microbiome shifting diet. So yeah, coffee I'm a fan of. As far as sparkling goes, I used to really not recommend it before because in America, when I was working with clients for so many years, we didn't have a good source. We didn't have great sources throughout the nation. We would in specialty stores. But in general, it would be force carbonated, and force carbonated is actually dehydrating for the human cell. Whereas the natural spring water, like you get it throughout most of Europe, now after living in Greece, I'm just kind of addicted to that wonderful sparkling water. It's so delicious. And you can really taste the difference in each brand from where it's coming from and all of that. So I have to say, I do drink quite a bit of that and I love it. So that's what I tend to buy. And then I'll drink that. So if I'm having a glass of water, it'll usually be sparkling, but natural. And otherwise, I'm getting my hydration from my soups and broth and things like that. I tend to not be very thirsty anymore.
And what are some of the brands over in the West where we can get naturally carbonated water?
I know Mountain Valley is one. That would probably be the best example. And I believe San Pellegrino as well. They used to be anyway. We'd have to double check. Those are the two that I know that you see in kind of every restaurant and store. Yeah.
And usually in glass, which is great.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
All right. I want to come back to the microbiome. You brought it up a couple times, and we'll use fiber as our entry point, which is another topic of controversy. So let's start with that. How do you feel about fiber? And then we'll move into the microbiome using that as our platform.
That is a great platform. Fiber is a tool that can be used and is not always appropriate, is what it is. So if someone is extremely disabled, they often need to fully avoid fiber because of what it does for the microbiome. Right? We've been told to push fiber and eat all this fiber and that it's good for bacterial diversity, but diversity doesn't equal health. What equals health is what bacteria are in the gut and in the body. We like to think the microbiome is the gut. It's not. It's everything. We're looking at it right now, right? Our eyes are covered with it. And it does far more for us than I think most can appreciate. So, for instance, if you and I sit down and we have lentils with broccoli, right? That's our meal. So we're having a lot of fiber. That fiber will go in and feed the bacteria within our body. It won't feed us. We don't eat our food at all. It is our bacteria that eat our food, and we eat their byproduct. So what their byproduct is incredibly important. And each family and each subspecies has a different byproduct. So that is something to know. So we sit down, we eat this high fiber meal. It's add in a sweet potato. Why not? And, and let's say my microbiome is really impaired. I was maybe a C-section birth, or I've had, a handful of antibiotics in my life. I live mostly indoors, so I'm not getting natural light, or I've been blocking the sun with sunscreen and hats. And let's say you're the opposite. You spend a lot of time outside every day. You haven't had many antibiotics, if any at all. You were naturally born and nursed. So, and you use kind of natural cleaning items in the home, like vinegar. Now, in our two situations, when we eat that same meal, that food is going to go into your body, and your good bacteria are going to eat that. And in the digestive process, they're going to release wonderful things for you that are anti-inflammatory. Butyric acid is a very common one, right? A fatty acid that downregulates cancer and does all sorts of good things. Whereas for me, after antibiotics and all sorts of things, even if it's been 20 years since I've had them, I could have a lot of overgrowth in my body. And that overgrowth is going to eat those pulses and that broccoli and that sweet potato. And when it does so, it releases toxins that are nerve toxins. They're fat soluble. They're hard to get out of the body. And those go towards the nervous system and make us very ill, weak. They get in the way of our feel-good chemicals, and they're inflammatory. So they can cause enormous amounts of weight gain, eating the same food as you with a steady weight. So the fiber can be either very beneficial, problematic, or neutral, right? And it really depends the body that it's going into. And it's not something you can really test for. You have to go based on how good your health is.
Okay. For somebody who will take the one scenario where they say were born C-section, been on antibiotics, yada, yada, how do they begin to fix that, or can they?
We can fix a lot of it. Yeah, I'm not too much of a fatalist. I've seen too many miracles to believe in that. But really, it would be a very rigid protocol. So this is where, you have to do a cost benefit analysis again, right? We always have to do those. If you're very, very ill, or that could be mentally ill, that could be physically ill, however you categorize it, it could be very much worth avoiding all starches and forms of sugar for 2 years to shift that microbiome. But you do have to know what you're doing, because very small changes in a food can make a big difference. So it's a big commitment. It does mean not eating in restaurants or friends' houses during that time, and that's got a bit of a sacrifice. So again, it has to be worth it. But if you do that, and then at the end you plant the correct species in, specifically species that deal with some of the things that we're having a lot of problems with these days. Like we tend to lack a lot of K2, right? And that's not from lack in our diet. There is that factor, but we also need a very set bacteria to produce that for us. And so having the right kind of microbes that produce the right kinds of vitamins and feel-good chemicals and dopamine, I would say is the other missing step. Whereas when I was teaching microbiome shifting diets, 10 years ago and more, we didn't have to plant so much. We just needed to avoid. Now I am finding quite a bit more of that really quite needed.
So that's where your approach is quite different than a lot of other people, where they're looking at putting different fibers in the body and feeding the bacteria that are already there. You're saying step one for somebody who is in a position where the microbiome is compromised, we want to take a lengthy period of time, if we're severe, to let things basically go back to a baseline.
That's right. Because if you feed, let's say you're in a state of chronic illness, that means you've got overgrowth going on in your body. And that bacteria could live for 3 days without its food, which is starch or sugar. They don't eat the protein and the fat. So it could be 3 days, it could be 24 months. And so when you have a really serious health condition, you want to err on the side of caution and go the full 24 to really starve out any kind of overgrowth and restart. It's a bit like giving yourself a rebirth. to be honest. You give yourself a new microbiome. And what that does is that informs the body to create healthy cells instead of a repeat of what you've been creating with the illness. So it can be really quite worth it. I mean, it was life-saving for me, right? So I'm obviously a fan, but because I do know how difficult that can be and what a sacrifice that could be perceived as if you don't have something as serious as I did. For me, it was freedom. But if your health issue isn't very bad, that would definitely be a sacrifice. So, case by case, but very much worth it. And then you want to start seeding. Yeah, because the issue with the fiber is that if you're healthy, it'll make you healthier. But if you're not, it'll make you worse.
All right. So most extreme case, 2 years, no carbs, resetting the microbiome.
Mm-hmm.
For somebody who isn't suffering with a serious condition, maybe they just had antibiotics a couple times, they aren't in the most extreme case, what's a more midline reset for somebody who is tuning in right now and interested in upping the health of their microbiome, but they don't need to go to that extreme? How would you work with them?
I'll tell you my favorite method, and that is to look at their history, look at what they've been prone to, and then to go with the antagonist. So in our bacterial realm, it's like a little, it's like Star Wars, actually. There's all these little battles, and if you're strategic with it, you can actually play them against each other so that you don't have to do the work, which is preferable, right? So for instance, if you take a family like E. coli, since everyone knows that one, if you or someone you know tends to get UTIs or did when you were like 10, that would tell me, or kidney infections, even one would tell me that you're lacking the good E. coli, right? Of which there's many. But then there's also antagonist to UPEC. So UPEC is the strain of E. coli that tends to cause the kidney infections and UTIs. So if you've had it cultured, then we can know. The same with things like staph A. If I know someone's had staph A, or if they're presenting with the kind of acne that's usually presented with that, then we can do bacterial antagonists. And there's very often like 3 to 5 bacteria that if we seed into your body, into your diet, those bacteria will go in and just annihilate that guy. Whereas the traditional method used to be, you take antimicrobials, whether natural or otherwise. Well, I think anyone who's taken a lot of antimicrobials will say it's an unending wheel of you take it and then you get it again and you take it and you get it again. Whereas if you have the antagonists in the body, they tend, of course, it's different with each bacteria, they tend to seed and stay in the body and keep you protected long term, while also doing amazing things for you, like producing 10 of your vitamins that you're needing and lacking. So you don't have to be taking a ton of supplements.
You mentioned these antagonists in the example of a UTI. How specific are those? Do you have a handful of those that you use for a wide range of conditions, or is it really specific on what the person's suffering with?
It's incredibly specific. Yeah. So it's not uncommon for me to spend 10 hours on one new person, just in writing up the bacterial recommendations and things like that. It's actually incredibly specific, but it's also awesome. So I can't say that I have to do that. I find it really fascinating and fun. It is specific, but I would say most people are dealing with the same kind of infections. So if we look at the general public, it's not who's coming into my office. Who's coming into my office are the super tough cases, right? So those are a bit more unique, and they're often dealing with multiple former tropical infections, right? So if we look at just America or Europe, you're dealing with strep. You're dealing with ear infections, you're dealing with UTIs, pneumonia, these kind of things. And so it is in that case, the same kind of ones. Yeah.
And then when you're assessing somebody, are you looking at health history and symptoms, or is there any objective testing you do to see what's going on in the gut?
I typically don't do testing. Yeah, I don't. Usually by the time someone comes to me, they're over tested. They have not been helped. And And honestly, we can tell so much by looking at someone, and it's an art form that has been really missed. So there's certain things, like if I see certain colors in the skin here, or things in the nails, there's actually a great deal that tells you what's going on. And so I'll usually go with that route. Um, there are some exceptions. Like I love SpectraCell tests. Those I'm in love with. I could write poetry to them just like I can with salt, but they're expensive, so I don't mandatorily run those. The benefit of those is that it tells you, and SpectraCell is just one of the brands that does it. There's lots of them. I have no I have no contract with them or anything, but they tell you what is being taken up into the cell, which is far more important. So if I see someone with, say, 20 deficiencies within the cell, if they see that, they're usually going to be disheartened because they have been trying really hard to eat really well for a long time, right? But it very often has nothing to do with what they've been eating. It has everything to do with their bacteria. And so, like, if there's a missing beneficial E. coli, I'm going to see the same 9 deficiencies across the board, because that bacteria is needed to create all those nutrients to be absorbed. So while, let's say I do get someone with a spectra cell and there's 20 deficiencies within the cell, we may directly address those in the beginning, but what we're actually going to do right after that is then get the right bacteria in there so that they're absorbing all those things instead of doing piecemeal nutrients, right? That kind of thing.
So if money is not a problem, that would be a beneficial test across the board?
Yes, definitely. Yeah,
Any
it's
others
amazing.
in that realm
Yeah.
that are, again, money not being in the picture are beneficial for you as a practitioner?
It's the NutriValve or the SpectraCell, anything that looks within the cellular health. Oh, no. There's a couple more. One would be the iodine loading test from Hakala Labs, but that is not an expensive one. If someone has traveled a lot, parasitesting.com is phenomenal because it's a parasitologist who looks at your results. And although he's not going in and taking biopsies of organs, because obviously, he is looking at saliva and urine and blood and other regions other than the stool, because most parasites are not in the colon. So that's a good one. I like if there's hormonal issues, especially with women, the Dutch panel that looks over the whole month and the pattern, that's quite good. Although I will say in general, we can see based on symptoms what's going on with the hormones. That one's less important, but still very good. Those are the main ones. I don't do microbial testing, but I do like to look at the GI maps and things like that if someone has it, because it can tell me a great deal about what we need to do and to support. So I may change my mind on that. But traditionally, I have not been a fan of the microbiome testing. It's been slightly inadequate to this point.
Let's come back to iodine, a controversial supplement, not so controversial in food form. How often do you see somebody deficient in that? And can we use food only to replenish it?
Those are really good questions. Iodine is almost deficient across the board. I don't know if I catch cases that are not. And I would say we would see that in our general public too. A bit like thiamine with the rice and cassava. We have a lot of things that get in the way of iodine being absorbed. And so even if we're eating a good amount of iodine in our diet, we could still have real deficiencies. The other issue is that we really need it in each of our cells. We think of iodine with the thyroid, but we need it in every single cell of our body. So it's rather important. And because it does get displaced by the other halo chemicals, the fluoride, the chlorine, the bromide, especially the bromide these days, it's very easy to push out and miss. If you add in someone like myself who is constantly on a flight, the aerotoxic chemicals on a plane displace the iodine as well. So we just have a lot going against us with that. Now, there are good ways to get it that we often don't think of, like ruminants, especially on the West Coast, like up in Oregon where I used to live. The cows and the sheep, they're grazing on grass that's high iodine. It's coming in over from the ocean and getting into the soil. So you can get iodine in some interesting places, not just in seafood or seaweed, but But in general, it is pretty deficient. Now, it's not something I address directly in across the board because I try to keep the supplements down, right? I'm working with the microbiome, so we don't want to do a ton. There's some exceptions to that, but not often. So we might do like painting on the skin to get at some of the skin when there's a very specific need, like we have a thyroid condition, something like that, then we may address it. But I think to get back to your question about the controversy of it, there's a couple of things that go into that. One is the study that came out in the 50s using a very toxic form of iodine that no human should be consuming. And then that getting into the hands of practitioners and the public and that being associated with dietary iodine, which is very different. It doesn't cause those health issues. And then secondly, there are many things that we will react to if we don't have a cofactor or we don't have something else that is needed. For instance, to take it to another area and I'll bring it back. Folate. A lot of people who have MTHFR and supplement with folate, they feel worse, right? So they stop. Well, if you feel worse when you take folate, that means you're actually missing B2. You're deficient in B2, ribose. And if you had enough of that, you'd feel great when you take folate. Okay. So very similar to that is the iodine, especially in Hashimoto's, right? Hashimoto's folks are usually terrified of iodine, often because of their experience, right? They've had a bad experience with it, where it kind of like crashed their thyroid or it made them much worse. But that happens when you don't have enough selenium. So anyone with Hashimoto's would need to do selenium first for a significant amount of time, at least a month, before trying low doses of iodine and then slowly going up. And then you don't have that kind of trouble. But yeah, those are the main reasons why iodine has been on the hot seat, so to say.
You mentioned this older form of iodine that's toxic. What is that so we can be aware of it?
Oh, no, there's so many, though. There's actually many forms of iodine. So, like when you go and get a CAT scan, right, they're going to infuse you with iodine. And that's not as bad as the one that was used in the 50s, but there are multiple forms of iodine. It's a bit like with any of the minerals. Like if you take, magnesium, we were talking about that before, right? We've got malate, we have glycinate, we have taurate, we have oxide, we have citrate. There's so many different forms and many of them are not meant for us. And that's just part of being an animal or human. We're not meant for all of them. Mm-hmm.
So if somebody is going to supplement with iodine, what form do we want to look for?
The potassium is very good. So I love iodoral. I know a lot of people use Lugol's and I'll do that on the skin. And Lugol's is a great company. No dish, no slant on iodoral, on Lugol's. But I like iodoral because it comes in small amounts that you can get to very high amounts. Often people need 300 micrograms. They'll stop at like 12. They often need to go up higher. And at that company, they make these tiny little pills that are very specific. So you can strategically increase slowly and see what's working for you while you work with your practitioner. So I like that because when we're working with the liquids, it's easy to get too much, too little, to not be very specific. And then you don't really know where your perfect dose is.
When it comes to iodine, does the average person need to supplement? It sounds like we possibly would. You mentioned the fact that if the animals are eating certain foods, we can get more through the food. But the average person on a maintenance type plan for their health, would they need to supplement and in what range?
It would be a really good idea. It's not something I tend to tell people to do. It's not something I do myself. So I want to be clear about that. But honestly, when you ask it that way, yes, it would be a really wise one to do preventatively and long term. Because even now, so I'm at a hotel right now. I'm sitting on a chair. This chair is going to be soaked in bromide, and that bromide is touching my skin. And as it does so, I'll absorb that and I will displace the iodine from my cells. So I will lose iodine just from sitting on this chair and being in this room with this carpet and this sofa, right? So when we actually look at it scientifically, yes, that's really wise because if you're consuming iodine regularly, it prevents the bromide from being absorbed instead, right? So it's very preventative. It's a really good thing. I do tend to have folks like pilots and airline attendants, those folks, to do the iodine preventatively. But I've never been big on those, the kind of mindset, and this is not correct actually. So I just want to state that as kind of my point of view. I tend to not be big on that. Like, these are your top 3 things you should take. But if I was going to add one to the top 3, iodine would be in there, probably along with like the animal form of A and benfotiamine, right? Because those are the things that we're really lacking and that lead to the cancers and the toxic buildup and some of those things. So those would be more preventative. But yeah, it would be a good idea to have the iodine. It would.
So when we were talking about a more midline case, somebody having dysbiosis in the gut, you talked about these specific species that you'd have that person ingest. Well, have you actually talk more about what form that would be? Would it be a probiotic, or how would they get that in there?
So that really depends on what I think we might need. So if I see that someone is lacking like folate and K2, then I'm going to look at the bacteria DE111, which is from natto and some of the Asian foods. But when we have that in our microbiome, we make all those things for us. So that I would probably just do from a supplement for ease. I do take into account the person I'm working with. And I just want to be honest about that. Some of my people are jet setters. And so for them, we're going to do supplements. That is so much easier with them. If someone is a homesteader, then we're going to make the ferments, but we're going to seed it with the right thing. So it's not uncommon for me to tell someone, okay, we're going to source this microbe. And sometimes I go direct to a lab to be able to get the right subspecies that I want. And then I'll have them start making a ferment where it can grow in, but isn't guaranteed. So like, if you buy a kimchi, many of them have L-Sakai, but not all. Okay. So we might start our own kimchi and we'd use a store-bought ferment that is a real ferment as the starter plus that probiotic. And then once we get that first bottle, we don't have to keep buying it because we can now just keep that ferment alive with the kimchi. So if I have someone who is in the kitchen or is really trying to heal, we do that because it saves a ton of money. It also makes you more independent, which is always a good part of health, right? And it's, you get often higher amounts when you do that. But there are exceptions. Like, we have a lot of dopamine deficient diseases. Parkinson's is a good example. Long COVID is another. But also things like ADD and depression and some of these shift work conditions as well. And sometimes there's a wonderful prepackaged product. Like if I can plug in something, I don't represent them. They don't know who I am. But there's this great product that you can get on Amazon called Lifted that has this combination of bacteria that's amazing for producing dopamine. And they don't even have on their label the subspecies, but anyone who works in microbiology, if you contact the company, you will be so impressed. It's amazing what that can do. So whenever there's something like that, I'll always get that. So I take into account the ease plus the lifestyle and what is needed to get that bacteria to really work, because and I guess I should state this too, the bacteria have very set homes that they need. So I think in the last one, I talked about Nissl 1917, the beneficial E. coli that eats pathogenic E. coli. Well, that one belongs in the colon. And it would be easy to think, oh, that should be in the vaginal canal for someone who gets UTIs. No. That can cause a lot of problems in the vaginal canal. So where it goes and how you take it in is actually important. So we take that into account.
All right. We've stated a lot of nuance, and obviously this conversation requires that. Everybody's different and they've had different histories. But for the person out there who just wants general rules to follow to maintain a healthy microbiome, what would that look like? You've mentioned fermented foods. You've talked about this specific product, but what are things that you're doing now that you have your health back that you're doing specifically to maintain a healthy microbiome?
That I can answer. And I do want to say I'm sorry. I know my answers are never clear. It's because I work with the full gamut. So it's humbling. You get humbled in real practice and you just learn to not have these solid yes and no's. But the things that are the most important are getting out in the light for sunrise. That's huge for the microbiome. Avoiding blue light in the house, using things like candlelight and red light as much as you can. A bit of blue light in the morning is perfectly good. It stimulates dopamine, serotonin, and melatonin later at night. having a truly pitch black bedroom at night, and I mean pitch black, it should be like a cave. Like if you wake up 2 hours later, you cannot see a shadow. That kind of room is necessary for the microbiome, because as much as we've talked about diet today, our bacteria, they communicate through quorum sensing. That's vibration, sound, and light. And so these things make a massive difference for them. In fact, sound is massive for the microbiome and for our fungal body as well, which we haven't even touched upon, but that's massive. So sound and light plus human contact is very important. The other thing that I would say, for if you want a healthy microbiome, you stop using store-bought things on your skin, really, and on your hair. You use the traditional methods, which are far more effective. Like yogurt on your skin is amazing, y'all. Boys and girls, like amazing. So using yogurt on the skin, that gives you acetophilus, which is what belongs on the skin, the halobiome, right, is what it's called. Not using things that damage the microbiome, like bleach and real soaps. So traditional soaps get rid of pathogenic bacteria, but not the good. Our modern soaps do both. So using a lot less of those kind of things, eliminating scents, like candles, just use essential oils instead. Those are actually bigger than the dietary things. The dietary things come in once that's been accounted for. Now, in addition to that, I always like to rope in clothing because we are living in plastic. What we wear is a huge factor on the microbiome. One, certain fabrics are not going to let light in, and our bacteria on our skin require light to function well, in addition to the light that goes in past that. So internally as well. The biggest one, though, is the toxic load, right? Our bacteria are very much affected by the toxic load in our body. And when we wear plastics, polyesters, and all these fabrics, one of the worst ways that we kind of wear ourselves down is through the inhalation of them. They release these tiny little particulates into the air, and then those go into our lungs. And that is a huge labor for our body and our liver to remove. Now, traditionally, humans would be detoxing these fat soluble toxins through the breath in the lungs, about 70% of them, right? But for that, you need to have perfect posture and perfect sinuses and perfect facial structure, which almost no one has these days. So then the liver gets the bulk of the burden. And when it's so busy doing that, it creates this sludge. I'm speaking metaphorically, but it's like a sludge. And so it can cause more of the bacterial overgrowth within the body. And then that bacterial overgrowth produces more toxins. And so you can see where that goes, right? And so reducing the toxin load within the house and within your daily life is honestly the biggest part of it. And then dietary items come in second. Now, the things I think are the most beneficial are getting your condiments right. Traditional condiments are all ferments. You can make mustard in less than 3 minutes, and it is delicious, and it is a probiotic ferment. So make your hot sauce, right? For all the slander of thrown towards nightshades, hot sauce is the least of all the offenders because it is fermented well. So you do still have a bit of the solanine, but it's nothing like eating a whole potato. Get your ferments, get your condiments as ferments, and you're getting a whole wide range of things that you're getting in on a daily basis without thinking. Do that, plus add some yogurt under your skin, and you've made it a long way if you get the light and lots of hugs and hopefully some pets in there.
All right, a lot I want to get into within that. Starting with the body building up toxins from the environment. If you're working with somebody who has been living a more traditional lifestyle, and by traditional, I mean Western, classic, typical lifestyle in the West right now, is there a certain protocol that you like to give them in the beginning to clear the body of those things, or using things like saunas? So it could be either things that we're taking in supplement-wise to detox, or things like saunas to help facilitate.
I mostly start cleaning up their life is what I do. So most of the people I work with are too sick to bring in the saunas in the beginning. If I'm working with a weight loss case or a mild health issue, absolutely. We go for saunas and sweating. We try to do a lot of sweating and also breath work. There's set forms of breath work that can help as well. So we definitely do those. I don't do binders. I know a lot of practitioners do, and that's certainly a fine way to go about it. It's just not a way that I go. If I'm working with a weight loss case that has been resilient, like they've tried quite a bit and it hasn't worked, then in those cases, I would do the high soluble fiber foods. So I might do like a lot of broccoli, and we would do very lean in that case, so that fiber, there's two kinds of fiber, and one of the forms the human body does not eat, neither does our bacteria. That's the form that we would use. So we're not talking about total cereal here, right? It's like artichokes. But that will, if you don't eat fat with that same meal, that will bind to the fat soluble toxins within the fat cells and pull that out through phase 2 and 3 in the liver. So we'll do that in certain cases. You do have to be healthy enough for that. So I can't do that in all cases, but definitely in some. Yeah.
All right, just so I'm clear. So when you take in this special fiber, it helps bind toxins and helps with weight loss?
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, there's many different ways to climb the mountain of weight loss, and they all work, but that is a really great one. It's a great one. Yeah, it's very effective because our fat cells, they do many things, but one of the primary things they do is store fat soluble toxins when the body can't handle it. And so those, just like the solanines, they're harder to remove from the body. They need to go through phase 2 and 3 of the liver, which is often very busy processing our cortisol and our sex hormones and other things. And so when we bring in the foods that are high in the soluble fiber, especially in lean meals, then it can really bind to that and help facilitate the removal of that.
All right, we'll come back to the weight loss piece, but I want to come back to the microbiome and light.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It sounds like there's two different pieces to this. The light affecting the microbiome on the skin, and then actually penetrating and affecting the internal microbiome. So let's talk about those two different pieces, because this is fascinating and not an area a lot of people get into.
It's my favorite. So we are going into a rabbit hole of pleasure for me right here. There was recently a study that was published. So it was actually published not a few years ago, but it was in the medical journals here and in Europe. They were putting it into the journals as articles, and I was blown away because it's things that when you work with the microbiome, you know about, but the public never gets. And honestly, the medical community doesn't either. So there was this big one that was released, and I can give you the link if you want to post it underneath, about superbugs in hospitals. We've all heard of those, right? You don't want to go to the hospital because they have the superbugs, and sometimes you can't avoid it, but ideally you avoid. Well, the findings were that the superbugs were not in the hospital. The superbugs were already in our microbiome as normal bacteria. But when you go to the hospital, the lights and the sounds within the hospital transform our normal bacteria into superbugs.
Wow, this is totally new for me. Keep going.
Yeah, it's mind-blowing, right? And so the light and the sound literally changes our bacteria constantly. Now, if you take that to fungus, and this is my newest venture, I've been nonstop researching. If you take this into the fungal realm, what are we seeing across the board? We are seeing so many cases of mold toxicity. It is uncanny, right? Now, when I go to places like Venice in Italy and places that are high mold, they don't traditionally have mold issues with people, even though there's black mold, right? And we've all known this. You meet a family where they had black mold in the house, there'll be a few individuals that got very sick, maybe one or a couple, but not all. So why is that? Well, that got me thinking. And then, I spent a lot of time in the indigenous lands. Well, there was a study that was released for the drumming in the indigenous lands and how the mycelium, the mushroom, right, the body underneath the soil, would only activate when the indigenous were playing their drums. It's a very specific drum, but it's the same note across the board. So what would happen when you have your drum circle is that the mycelium activate and they take nutrition throughout the whole forest, but only with certain sounds. Now, what do we have that's so different now in our houses? Very different sound and light than 50 years ago, incredibly so, right? We have all this ambient noise from the refrigerators and other devices, right? We don't even notice it because it's so normal for us. Then we have all these lights as well, which really affect not only our hormones, but really our bacteria and fungus. But yeah, so there's been a lot of research in that field. And if you take it into like other areas of sound medicine, like the 128 hertz, which activates if you hear or you hum or you play it in your environment, it produces nitric oxide in your body, which is incredible. So there's a lot there that's going on with the bacteria, the fungi, and I think phages really coming out next.
Coming back to that drumming story piece. So when certain beats are played by the drums, it affects the fungi in the soil. If you take that story even further, do they end up ingesting those when they grow, or how does that impact them as humans, or does it?
No, it speaks more towards how we are one part in nature and that our natural acts actually affect nature in wonderful ways, right? So us playing the drums, if it was us, then the rest of the forest gets bathed in nutrition when we do that. And it needs us there, right? Nature is wise. There's never any plant in nature that isn't needed in that forest. We may not know why, but we would be part of that, right? As well. So when we take people out of forests, like take the Batwa, the pygmy population that belong in the Bwindi impenetrable forest in parts of Uganda and Rwanda, they were all removed 30 years ago, which means they're not drumming there anymore. They can't even go in without getting killed, right? So they're not drumming anymore. So how is the forest being affected? Well, very clearly, it's not going to get as much nutrition. But yeah.
And when that comes to us in the West in a more practical way, we have our microbiome, we have a virome.
Mm-hmm.
Do we have fungi that are in our gut making up, that whole ecosystem?
Yes. Last I checked, we had 247 different kinds of fungi. There may be more that have been discovered now. Most of those are beneficial. So I do think a large part of the issues that we've had with Candida and some of the more pathogenic are due to the fact that we don't have as many of the good, right? That was certainly the case with our bacteria and definitely the case with the virome, right? Which is 37,000 times bigger than the microbiome. It's massive. But yes, yeah, definitely. We do require good fungi. And traditionally we would get a lot of that through dairy consumption in regions that do that. Not all cultures, of course, ate dairy, but a lot of them did. And a lot of the cheeses, there's a interesting fungus within blue cheese that counteracts the black mold. So there's a number of different things that could be factors there. But yes, to answer your question, there's absolutely beneficial and pathogenic within that biome as well.
So as a piece of this then, when we're humming or listening to music of a certain hertz, that it's having a positive impact on the fungi in our body?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's certain wavelengths that seem to be much better. I'm not a musician, so I'm not in this field to speak on properly, but I do know that the tune that music was tuned to before 1935 was very different hertz than currently done. And although listening to music in general is calming for humans, the benefits for the former, which I think is 432, I'd have to double check, I think it's 432, is monumental for what it does for our parasympathetic nervous system. And I think we can bring that in further, right? So many people are in thought medicine, right? And you can think yourself better. And as someone who used to be sick, that can honestly be pretty insulting, folks, if you haven't been sick. Like it really can, because no one thinks themselves that way or gets themselves there on purpose. But we can certainly, there's no question that we can get out of health issues through changing the way we approach life and the way that we think and the way we reframe things, because people have done it. It's Herculean. It's super hard. It was too tough for me. It was only part of what I did. Had it been fully successful, I would be shouting it from the rooftops. It is for some folks. I was not that good, but but I do think we can go internal as well and see that aspect, because we do have a vibration to our thoughts as well. Right. So there's very good studies on what we watch in terms of movies and shows and how that impacts our nervous system and our immune system. But I do think it goes much further than that into our internal world as well.
And with a lot of these, you can see how there's two different sides to all of them, whether it be dietary and things that are toxic we want to avoid and things that are healthy to bring in. And we can apply this to sound. We can apply it to movies and different media we're taking in. So where I want to go from there is when it comes to these sounds and the fungi in our body, are you somebody that's playing music of that hurts, like as you go to sleep to nourish your fungi, or how do you do that in a practical sense? And then from the other way around, because we're in this modern society and we do have things like air conditioning, refrigerators, and we can't necessarily turn those off, is it just about putting that music in the environment to offset it? Or how do we use this sound piece in a practical way in the modern environment?
Yeah, that's a great question, because that's always the most important thing, right? It's so fun to learn about these things, but if we can't apply them, what's the point? So I think the best way to go about it is to spend as much time as humanly possible in nature, really. Traditionally, if you go to houses that were built in the 1800s, there was always a tuberculosis room, which was a screened-in porch where the beds would be placed if someone was ill. And what you get with that is you get the sounds of nature, right? The birds, if anyone listening is on a farm, you'll know this from the time you were born. The chickens are the first ones up every day. Their circadian rhythm goes first, and it actually wakes up the plants and us as well, and the other animals on the farm. So there's a circadian rhythm to nature that pulls us in, and it's done through sound and light. So that's very important. We also, in light medicine, which is just so fascinating, there's a new quote unquote vitamin that they're calling. And lots of people used to kind of jest about this, but it's actually true now. It's been shown. And that is that the light that comes through the leaves of a forest, the green light that comes in, has a very specific effect on our body, a very positive effect on our body. Now, many cultures like Japan, they have forest bathing that they traditionally do at least once a week, where they basically go into the forest all day, right? But this is incredibly good for us. So what I try to get people to do, one, we stop bringing in the things that are problematic. So most people who are ill, especially in America, they are broke. They are living on the favor of someone else, right? And so you can't always turn off things like refrigerators and all of that. But what you can do is stop listening to music that isn't tuned to 432 hertz. You can open your window or spend more time outside. So you can be laying down on a porch or on the grass, on a blanket, if you can get outside. So spending lots and lots of time outside is really very beneficial to that. And then you can get tuning forks too. So like when I need to boost someone's nitric oxide, if they like things like tuning forks, we can get them a 128 tuning fork, and then they can play with that, and that's going to help. So you can go about it that way. But a lot of it is what you avoid. It's avoiding, certain shows on the TV and certain types of music and things like that.
Coming back to our superbugs in the hospital and the lighting there, creating those from what we already have in our microbiome, how do we, in a practical sense, use natural light to enhance the microbiome on the skin, in our guts? And yeah, I'll have you start there, and we'll go a bit deeper if we need to.
It's so important. It's so important. The light before 10 a.m., down regulates our histamines more than anything else that has been studied. So a lot of people with histamine disorders think they can't go out in the sun because the sun can make it worse. Well, it can if it's really hot. Yeah, absolutely. Because heat increases cortisol and that increases histamines, but not if it's before 10 a.m. And if you're somewhere very, very hot, go early, go at sunrise, right? Sunrise also, so that morning light, that triggers your feel-good chemicals. So someone who's just waking up at home, scrolling through their phone, listening to a TV, getting the kids ready, getting in the car, running errands, then going to work, good luck getting your feel-good chemicals processed. You have to get it in your eye and not through glass, right? So you really need direct daylight, or I should say, daylight. It doesn't have to be sunny, right? So if you're in the UK, don't despair. You're fine. It can be very cloudy or rainy, but you do need that natural light in your eye. So there's a couple of different factors there. You need both the eye and the skin. The more skin exposure, the better. Now, one question I always had personally was Nordic countries and Arctic countries. How did they not get seasonal affective disorder in the winter? Well, it turns out firelight, which is what is used in those places during the winter, will do most of this for you. So, having an actual fire in the house in the morning is great. That does a lot too, or in the evening as well. The microbiome and the light is shifted. So getting a lot of sun on your skin each day will shift the microbiome more than diet will. So as much as I work with diet, because that's something I can actually control, with folks, the daylight is incredibly important in order to keep that microbiome very healthy. And that means a lot of skin area, right? That really does mean not wearing a ton of clothes or taking off what you can so that you get as much sun exposure as possible. And on the flip side of that, not using the sunscreens and the hats and the sunglasses. The sunglasses are really problematic for the microbiome.
And when it comes to the gut microbiome specifically, does having the stomach area exposed to the light
Yes.
have specific benefit? Talk more about that.
Yes, it does. In fact, I just had someone yesterday, I was telling about this because I don't tend to see the emergency cases. I'm not in emergency medicine. So, but the bloating and the stomach issues I tend to see is with a soft belly without sharp pain. Anytime you have a hard belly, like a basketball, you need to go and be seen by someone. It's usually not great. So they came in, there was a new client with this, a rock hard belly. And I was like, please go get seen by someone. But until you do, get out in the sun and take your shirt off, because the light directly on the stomach actually makes a massive difference, really. And I think that's why in many cultures, the belly was exposed. Look at traditional Hinduism. Right? They would practice a lot of this. They would use things like mustard oil in the belly button and then light on the stomach, especially for women. So yes, it seems silly or trite, but actually it shifts the microbiome massively to have the light on very specific areas.
And how quickly does the microbiome change when we start avoiding some of the stuff we've been talking about, including others, and really making an effort to improve it?
It can actually change radically in 3 days. Now, I want to couch that with saying, or buffer that, with saying that if you're dealing with a severe disability, you're not going to have any difference that you feel in 3 days. It's going to be like 6 months at least. But technically speaking, if we test parts of the microbiome, we change your diet, that's all we have to do. In 3 days, it is radically different. So there's been some studies with like the Hadza and some of the other hunter-gatherers where someone from our culture will do a microbiome test and then go stay with them for 3 days and do another one. And it has radically shifted. So I think that's why we see something a lot of us have experienced of going over to another country and eating all sorts of foods that would usually cause weight gain or, tummy troubles. And instead you're losing weight and you feel great and you have no problem. The way that the food is eaten, the way it's processed and the amount of light and walking, all of that has a huge impact on the microbiome. So 3 days, technically.
Well, let's stick on the weight loss piece. I want to come back to it, and you just touched on it again. We mentioned this specific type of fiber you'd include if somebody's trying to lose weight.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people that are tuning in well, in the West, it's just there are so many people these days that are battling with a weight challenge. What else would you add to that protocol to help them out?
Akkermansia. I would use Akkermansia. So there's this bacteria called Akkermansia, very easy to find, that increases GLP-1. Now, most people are tuned in enough to know that all the Hollywood stars are using Ozempic, right? Which is the weight loss peptide. Well, what that does is what Akkermansia does. It increases GLP-1. So rather than going to a physician and getting a prescription and injecting yourself with this peptide, you can simply seed Akkermansia into your body and start losing weight right away, as it does the same thing, but the way nature intended. So I always like to use a little Akkermansia. That gives people a lot of encouragement. Uh, and then, of course, we always balance blood sugar. Always. Yeah, that's really a big piece. And we might look at Firmicutes, Bacteroidetes, some of those other bacterial ratios that lead to weight gain, especially if someone has had a lot of antibiotics as well.
Let's talk more about the blood sugar piece, because this is something that is so common. People that are, snacking between meals, always trying to bring up their blood sugar because they've, probably had too many carbs at the last meal and they're having those drops and they need to help boost it back up. How do you look at that as a whole? Somebody that wants to start regulating it better, is it just about cutting down on carbohydrates, or how do you help somebody with their metabolic health?
I will usually, it depends on the case, but I will very often get them into ketosis. Now, we don't do a high fat ketosis like I would with seizures or cancer, because we want the person to use their own fat stores for energy. So we do like a moderate protein, moderate fat, lower carb. And the carbs that we use are from those soluble fiber vegetables, if we have that option with that person's digestive system. Because, we've been almost brainwashed to think that weight gain and being overweight or obese is a character flaw, that we're not disciplined enough, that we've eaten too much and exercised too little. But it's really a state of inflammation is really what it is. And anytime someone is struggling with their weight, it's an indication that something is not right in the body. Something is creating inflammation, because a healthy person with a healthy microbiome does not ever struggle with weight. It doesn't matter if they eat a lot, actually. The microbiome handles that just fine, and their weight stays the same all the time. If you think back to, or even just go into antique shops, people didn't have multiple sizes of clothing in each closet. They had the same things through their whole life. Their body was always the same. And it didn't matter that the season changed or that the diet changed by season. Their weight would maintain the same. Now, we have very stretchy clothes today, so someone can gain 30 pounds and not realize until they look at a picture. But that has to do with the microbiome. And so I think if we start looking at weight more like a health condition, of which it is, right? It's like blaming someone for having cancer. That would be ridiculous, right? We shouldn't blame someone for weight either, but rather look at what's actually going on there, that there's inflammation being created when it shouldn't be, that it's suppressing the immunity, right? Even if your BMI, which BMI is a little ridiculous, but even if your BMI is only 25, let's say, that suppresses your immunity by over 30%. To every infection, to cancer, to anything that can be affected by that. So the weight epidemic we have is really quite significant. And everything from the light that we're using at night, that's a huge thing that I change, FYI. We get at the HRV and we get the blue light out in the evening, so that we can regulate ghrelin and leptin, the hunger hormones. But in general, I just try to get them to where they're actually satiated. They're not hungry. Their blood sugar isn't spiraling. We definitely don't do snacking. Absolutely not. Yeah, because that keeps the blood sugar high. And we'll bring in fasting when it's appropriate as well.
All right, let's talk more about the fasting and the no snacking.
Sure.
Are you a fan of 3 meals a day, or how do you look at a person's health and decide on that?
I will start them at 3 meals a day, but I like to get them down to 2 or 1 is what I do. And I do it when it comes natural. So I try not to force it so that we don't have an added stress. right? I like to keep whatever stress we can low. So if they're starving, that's not going to help to get them to a place of low inflammation, right? Because that cortisol that they're going to have in response to it is going to spike the inflammation, and that means weight gain and reactive eating. So instead, we will get them to 3 meals a day, plenty of protein and fat so that their satiety hormone is triggered, bring the carbs down. Sometimes it depends on how well the person is. If they're very well and we basically have weight loss and some minor things, I'll often bribe them with like keto junk food. I'll have them make cheesecake or something that doesn't have sugar because it's very easy to make that very healthy. We'll start with those things because once their hunger goes away and once they feel like they're getting treated, they're not just eating salads, they don't care about the healthy junk food anymore because they're not hungry. They're satiated. So then we can we kind of go in stages and get to healthier, more traditional. I like to go that way. I find it much more kind than to kind of, go the puritanical route and be like, you have to know all these things and you have to utterly change your diet. And you need to be eating sheep's brain. That just turns people off. So I bribe them with cheesecake and then we get going.
How often would you recommend somebody do a longer fast? Earlier, you talked about dry fasting, so you can bring that in too. In a more therapeutic sense, how can somebody incorporate some longer fasts and different type fasts?
Well, I like to do a 3-day fast. So if someone is well enough, if they don't have wasting, then a 72-hour fast is great, right? That's where you get the most benefit with the least amount of negative stress. Now, I don't do much of the long-term fasting. I do have clients I had one who did a 40-day fast before I met them. There's certainly times for that where you might want to do a 7-day or something like that. But I tend to do the 72-hour myself. And that's what I'll teach for people once they're pretty healthy. For that can be once a month to once a season. It's not only great for your health, it's actually very great for your mind. I do it more for the internal, for the discipline, for the character building. I find it very good for that. And then you also get the health benefit, which is nice. But those are the ones I usually do. Now, in terms of dry fasting, those you have to be monitored or you have to be healthy enough for. The folks I work with typically have very irregular vasopressin. So I haven't pushed that. But in my own self, what I do is I practice it whenever I need to. So like the first time was an accident. I was hiking on Mount Olympus and I hadn't arranged the trip and someone else did. And I didn't know we were going to be gone for so long and no one brought anything. So I just flipped it to the positive and I was like, right, okay, I'm going to dry fast. This is good for me, right? Instead of like miserable. So that's kind of how I would do it. Or if I have a 17-hour flight, I'm going to do it for that. Those kind of things is usually when I will bring it in. But I've certainly had friends and colleagues who have done it much more intentionally. And it really is pretty amazing, dry fasting.
All right, last piece I want to tie into all this for weight loss and beyond, movement. How do you look at that for somebody, again, in both those cases?
Thank you for bringing that up. I don't think anyone ever asked me that. The movement I usually have folks do is the traditional and ancestral movement. So that's going to be things like walking, hiking, biking, swimming, dancing. Dancing is ideal if you're healthy. These movements all really pull the lymph. It cleans the lymph. We often forget that our lymph system, it does not have a pump. We do need to move. But the problem I find is that especially in America, North America, everyone is so outcome driven and rather masculine, right? The women's workouts are very masculine, which produce an enormous amount of cortisol. They make you more hungry and actually get in the way of weight loss. So if you go to CrossFit, you'll see a lot of women who have extra weight on them. They're very strong. I don't mean that, but there's that padding. There's quite a bit. And that comes from that spike of cortisol, right? Males and females handle that very differently. So it's really more ideal for us to do a bike ride rather than a spinning class, right? A walk rather than a run. I never let people run. I don't care how much they love it or how good it is for the mental state. It's really problematic for things like weight loss and healing because it's pumping cortisol constantly, stress. And what is stressful to our body is very different than us emotionally. Very, right? Like eating at different times is a massive stress for the body. So I like the more, you can get very strong. Like I do a power yoga every morning. I guess I should mention that. So you could do something like that. But things that don't tend to cause negative stress because we do have so much stress in our current society. Yeah. You want to mitigate it where you can, but still move.
For somebody that's tuned into this point and they're dealing with a specific health challenge and they want to work with you, are you currently taking on new patients?
I am now. I opened up my practice. I don't know how long it'll be open for, but I did. It's maryruddick.com. And I think right now it's like a 2-month wait list. So it's shorter. Yeah, because I haven't advertised that yet.
And what type of people would you work with? Would it be all the way from like weight loss to more complicated chronic health issues?
Yeah, I'm known for like the tough cases, but I don't not work with anyone. I work with all of it. And I actually really like that. I like working with the full gamut. I work with a lot of fertility, a lot of nervous system disorders, a lot of disability, but I work with people from all ages, from infancy to elderly years. And honestly, it keeps me on my toes. It keeps me sharp to do that. I think if it's always a hammer and a nail, I would be a doll. I wouldn't be much help, I don't think, to anyone. Yes.
Well, we're going to link up your website, Mary. We're going to link up your social media, everything in the show notes. Round 2 has been a real pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's been so fun to be back. Thank you for having me.
Now that you're done, you're going to want to stick around here and catch this other incredible episode. You don't want to miss it. I'll see you over there.
A person who eats only plants cannot get cholesterol, therefore will not be able to adequately make, especially women, the hormones they need for their cycle, for adolescence, and to address stress. We evolved to eat this food.